it's very strange. Like, it shows the lash marks on his body.
Yeah.
It shows his facial features. It shows the holes where his wrist is, where he was crucified.
Deciphering the genetic code of the Turin Shroud was supposed to end the debate forever, but instead it opened a door to a new kind of mystery. Most people think the shroud is either a holy relic or a clever fake, but the truth is much more strange. See, when researchers looked at the mitochondrial DNA, they found traces of people from across the entire globe. It is not that simple, though. Among the traces of blood and skin, there is one detail that is so out of place, it has left researchers speechless.
While people all over the world have been struck by its stunning imprint of the face of Jesus Christ, not everyone's convinced that the shroud is a genuine holy relic.
What most people realize is that the shroud is not just a cloth, it is a biological record. World History Blueprint. The Turin Shroud is a rectangular piece of linen measuring about 14.4 feet long and 3.6 feet, 1.1 meters wide. For centuries, people have believed it is the burial cloth of a very famous historical figure who lived 2,000 years ago. The image on the cloth shows a man who seems to have been through a lot of pain. There are marks on his wrists, feet, and side. For a long time, people just argued about whether it was a painting or something else. But recently, science has taken a massive leap forward. Researchers decided to look at the DNA that was stuck to the cloth. They used a process called genomic sequencing to figure out exactly what was there. This was not just about finding one person. They vacuumed up dust particles and tiny bits of material from the cloth to see what they could find. What they discovered was a massive mix of DNA from all over the world. What most people do not realize is that this cloth has a very long travel history. The DNA showed traces of people from Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and even places as far away as India and East Asia. This is a key detail because it shows that thousands of people have touched this cloth over hundreds of years. It has been in Constantinople, France, and finally in Turin, Italy. But here is the catch. While a lot of the DNA comes from people who were just looking at the relic, some of the DNA is much older and more specific. Scientists found traces of plants that only grow in certain parts of the world. For example, they found pollen from a plant called Gundelia tournefortii. This plant is very common in the area around Jerusalem. Because this adds a lot of weight to the idea that the cloth did not start in Europe during the Middle Ages. The crazy part is that the human DNA found on the shroud is not just from one group. There are genetic markers from the Caucasus and Anatolia. This means the shroud has a history that is much more complicated than a simple fake made in a shop in the 1400s. Some researchers think this proves the shroud really did come from the Middle East and traveled through many hands before it ever reached Europe. But there is a specific detail that has started to worry the people studying it. They found human male DNA that is extremely degraded. This DNA shows signs of being under intense stress. Scientists found high levels of something called bilirubin in the bloodstains. This only happens when a person is under extreme physical trauma before they pass away. The experts are looking at these markers and realizing that the man in the shroud was not just someone who died of natural causes. The chemistry of the blood confirms that he suffered a great deal. There are also signs of creatinine and ferritin in the fibers. These are chemicals that show up in the human body when muscles are crushed and the body is pushed to its absolute limit. This matches the image on the shroud perfectly. The mystery is how all these different things can exist on one single piece of cloth. It is like a biological sponge that has soaked up the history of the world and the pain of one specific man. Many people are wondering if we have been looking at this the wrong way for all these years. It is not just a religious object, it is a crime scene that is 2,000 years old. But as they dug deeper into the DNA sequences, they found something that does not make any sense at all. They found sequences that seem to be fragmented in a way that science cannot easily explain. Some people are calling these impossible patterns. While most of the DNA can be traced back to humans who handled the cloth, there are bits and pieces that do not seem to fit the timeline. This is where the tension starts to build. If the shroud is just a medieval painting, why does it have all this ancient Middle Eastern DNA and signs of extreme trauma that were only understood by modern medicine? But the most shocking discovery was yet to come from the blood itself. Unexplained blood science. When you look at the blood stains on the Turin Shroud, they are not just red spots on an old cloth. They are a treasure map for scientists. In 1978, a group of researchers called the Shroud of Turin Research Project spent 5 days straight examining every inch of the linen. They found that the blood was real human blood, type AB. This is a very interesting detail because type AB is quite rare globally, but it is much more common in people from the Middle East. See, it is not that simple though. The blood is still red, which is weird because old blood usually turns brown or black over time. Scientists found that the reason it stayed red is because of the high levels of bilirubin we mentioned earlier. This happens when the liver is struggling because the body is going through something terrible. In 2024, a researcher named Giulio Fanti from the University of Padua took another look at these stains. He used very powerful microscopes and found things that most people would never see. He identified pre-mortem and post-mortem blood. This means the man was bleeding while he was alive and also after he had already perished. He found serum halos around the bloodstains which only show up under ultraviolet light. These halos are a sign that the blood had separated into its different parts, which is exactly what happens during a slow and painful end. This matches the description of a crucifixion perfectly. The nail marks in the wrists and feet produced specific types of bleeding that the shroud captured with incredible accuracy. And get this, there are also traces of spices like myrrh and aloes on the fibers. This matches ancient burial customs from the Middle East. A researcher named Kelly Kearse looked at these clotting patterns and found that they are consistent with a body that was not washed before it was wrapped. This is a key detail because it suggests a very hurried burial, which is exactly what the historical record describes for the figure many believe the shroud represents. But here is the deal. While the blood tells a story of suffering, the DNA inside that blood is giving experts a headache. It is very hard to get a full genetic profile because the DNA has broken down over 2,000 years. However, some scientists claim to have found Y chromosome signals that point to a male origin. This is hands down one of the most debated parts of the study. Some people want to use this DNA to try and clone the man, but that is basically impossible. The DNA is too fragmented for that, but the fact that we can even find male markers after all this time is amazing. It shows that the cloth has preserved biological information in a way that almost seems impossible. What most people do not realize is that the shroud was kept in a silver box for a long time, which might have helped protect some of these samples. So here's the deal. We have a cloth with real blood from a man who was tortured with DNA from all over the world and spices from ancient Jerusalem. If this was a fake made by an artist in the year 1300, how did they know to include blood with high bilirubin? How did they know to add microscopic traces of pollen from plants that only grow in Israel? It would be the most complex and perfect forgery in the history of the world. And that is putting it lightly. Experts are starting to realize that the more they study the blood, the more it points to a real event that happened in a real place. But even with all this biological evidence, there is one thing that still does not add up. For a long time, many people thought the mystery was solved in 1988. That was the year 3 different labs did radiocarbon dating on a small piece of the shroud. They all came back with a date between 1260 and 1390. This made it look like the shroud was a medieval fake. Many experts were satisfied with this, but others were not so sure. They argued that the piece of cloth used for the test was from a corner that had been repaired after a fire in 1532. They thought the labs were dating a mix of original linen and newer threads used by nuns to fix the damage. Recently, in 2020, researchers did a reanalysis of that data. They found that the results from the 3 labs did not actually agree as much as everyone thought. There were big differences in the dates, which suggests the sample was not uniform. Oh, and this is a key detail because it means the 1988 test might not be the final word. But here is the catch. If the shroud is not from the Middle Ages, then where did it come from? Some scientists have used new methods like wide-angle X-ray scattering to look at the aging of the linen fibers. This study suggested the cloth could actually be 2,000 years old. The crazy part is that the way the image was formed still cannot be explained by science. It is not paint,
Or it is not a scorch. It is not a photograph. It is only on the very surface of the fibers, thinner than a human hair. In 2025, a researcher named Cicero Marias used three-dimensional analysis to see how the image would look if it were wrapped around a human body. He found that a cloth wrapped around a real person would produce a distorted and warped image. But the image on the shroud is very flat and proportional, almost like it was made from a low-relief sculpture. This has led some people to believe it was created by a specific type of artistic process that we do not fully understand yet. What most people do not realize is that the image contains three-dimensional information. If you put the shroud image into a computer that reads light and dark as distance, you get a perfect three-dimensional shape of a man. This does not happen with regular paintings or photos. It is like the image was encoded into the cloth using some kind of energy. This is where the rumors start to get wild. Some people think it was a burst of light or radiation that happened at the moment of a miracle. While scientists cannot prove that, they also cannot prove it was made by an artist. The DNA evidence actually adds to this confusion. If it was a medieval fake, you would expect to find DNA from the person who made it. Instead, we find DNA from a dozen different countries and ancient plant life. It is like the shroud is trying to tell us two different stories at once. One story says it is a medieval object, and the other says it is an ancient relic from the time of the Bible. This contradiction is exactly what keeps the experts awake at night. But even the three-dimensional mystery hides a detail that is even more unsettling. The most recent DNA studies have focused on the human mitochondrial DNA found on the shroud. This is passed down from mothers to children, and it can tell us a lot about where someone came from. Researchers found a group of markers called haplogroups. They found markers like H1 and H3, which are common in Europe, but they also found haplogroup U6, which is found in North Africa, and haplogroup M, which is very common in India. This is a key detail because it means the shroud has been in contact with people from almost everywhere. Some scientists think this is terrifying because it means the cloth is so contaminated that we might never find the original DNA of the man himself. So, what do you think about these latest DNA findings? Do you believe the Turin Shroud is the real burial cloth, or is it just the world's most impressive mystery? If you enjoyed this dive into the genetic secrets of history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more investigative tales.